Morning. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove. I'm Father Alexander. Now, here we are in the book of Proverbs, and we're on our 208th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And I'm going to be looking at chapter 7, verses 6 et sequitur. Now, um, a general question. How much of the Bible is written by eyewitnesses? Once upon a time, the answer to that was a great deal. Now, with modern biblical scholarship, it came about that people said hardly any of the Bible was written by eyewitnesses. Now, I think that that has changed slightly, and people are saying, yes, there are actually quite a few passages in the Bible which were written by people who were actually there or spoke to people who were actually there. They've often dismissed modern biblical scholars in their wisdom. They've dismissed the claims to eyewitness status in, for example, the writings of St. Luke, the Acts of the Apostles, the famous we passages. We set sail, we made good progress. They said, no, this isn't a first person account at all. That's just a literary device. Well, you could argue about that. I think these things were first person accounts, actually. And I think the evidence of the Bible as literature does give you a very strong case for making these first person accounts. Also, in St. John, we've got this is the testimony of one who saw it, he said, about the piercing of Jesus' side. And from what we know, medical knowledge, the piercing of Jesus' side would have looked very much like that, and it's most unlikely somebody would have made it up. So that too is an eyewitness account. Once we say that those are in eyewitnesses' account, other things could easily be eyewitness accounts as well. Why do we always assume that the Bible, in making a claim, is mendacious? It's not. Now, in the Old Testament, eyewitness accounts are rather different. In the sense that, first of all, the history books, it's very likely that the throne succession narrative, which we talked about, the time of the demise of King David, the rise of King Solomon, was written by somebody who was actually there. Although, if you remember, I talked about it, I think, there's a little line that rather gives the game away. It says, she put on her whatever it was, which was what the king's daughters wore in those days. It's probably written about 100 years later. You know, it's a bit like she reached for her farthingale, which was what the king's daughters wore in those days, or something. She reached for her bonnet, which is what the ladies wore on their heads in those days. Might be 100 years later, but it's clearly based on something that has real knowledge of what was going on in the court of King David. Now, quite often since the Romantic movement in Britain, we've privileged the self as the authoritative observer of real life. And so I wandered lonely as a cloud. We're very interested in that I. We're very interested in Wordsworth's personal experience of what a daffodil looks like. We're not interested in daffodils, but we are interested in what Wordsworth made of them. So the ancient people didn't have this obsession with the I that we have, I as in me, myself. The obsession with the I, if we can call it that, really comes in with Saint Augustine in the Christian era. In the Old Testament time, it was not a big thing. So, for example, when you say, hello, let's read the prophet Isaiah, nobody's really interested in who the prophet Isaiah might have been, or the fact that there might have been at least three authors of the book of the prophecy of Isaiah. Who's speaking is not the question they would ask. They would rather ask, what is being said? But here in chapter 7, we have the most astonishing passage, it strikes me, of which has survived all these centuries, of somebody seeing something and telling us what they saw, an eyewitness account. Though it then goes into a bit of a flight of fancy, as you'll see, an imaginative account, a curiously modern account, a very dramatic account. Here he goes. While I was at the window of my house, I was looking out through the lattice, and I saw among the callow youths, I noticed among the lads, one boy who had no sense. Going along the lane, near the corner where she lives, he reached the path to her house at twilight when day is declining, at dead of night and in the dark. And look, A woman is coming to meet him, dressed like a prostitute, false of heart. She is loud and brazen. Her feet cannot rest at home. Once in the street, once in the square, she lurks at every corner. She catches hold of him, she kisses him. The bold-faced creature says to him, I had to offer a communion sacrifice. I have discharged my vows today. That is why I came out to meet you, to look for you, and now I have found you. I have spread coverlets over my divan, embroidered stuff, Egyptian material, posh. I have sprinkled my bed with myrrh, with aloes and cinnamon. Come on, we'll make love as much as we like till morning. Let us enjoy the delights of love. For my husband is not at home. He has gone on a very long journey, taking his money bags with him. He will not be back till the moon is full. With her persistent coaxing, she overcomes him, lures him on with her wheedling patter. Forthwith he follows her, like an ox on its way to the slaughterhouse, like a madman on his way to the stocks, until an arrow pierces him to the liver, like the bird that dashes into the net without realizing that life is at stake. And now, son, listen to me. Pay attention to the words I have to say. Do not let your heart stray into her ways or wander into her paths. She has done so many to death, and the strongest have all been her victims. Her house is the way to Sheol, that's hell, the descent to the courts of death. Now, it ends with a repetition of what's gone before. The adulterous woman is the woman who leads you to death. So, again, somewhat similar to Eve, but not altogether similar to Eve. But this opening passage is remarkable. While I was at the window of my house, that's real. That really happened. He was standing at the window of his house, idling, looking through the lattice. They didn't have glass in those days. And he sees the young men in the streets, the lads, the callow youths, the idlers, as you would see in any southern European town, boys on their Vespers in an Italian piazza. And then, of course, he sees one of them wander off down this lane and knock at the door of this house, which has an ill repute. Now, it's slightly unclear whether the woman is a fully fledged prostitute or whether she's just dressed like a prostitute. She's a married woman and her husband is away. Is she just an adulterous woman or is she actually a professional prostitute? It's a little bit ambiguous, it seems to me. The bold-faced creature. It's very, very convincing. It has the ring of truth, this. It is a wonderful evocation of sin and what sin is like. So, going along the lane near the corner where she lives. So you see, there is some sort of red light district, even in this ancient Jewish town, this ancient Hebrew town. He reaches the path to her house at twilight when day is declining. In other words, it's getting dark, it's sort of discreet, and he knocks on the door and she lets him in. She is loud, and look, a woman is coming to meet him, dressed like a prostitute, false of heart, like a prostitute, not actually a prostitute. So, what does all this tell us? Well, first of all, I think this passage is admirable from the fact that it's so direct and it's so astonishing and it's so alive. I think this is a wonderful passage of literature and therefore to be read. I think this is just as good as any poem in the English language about the affairs of the heart. It's just as good as some of those wonderful Victorian poems by, let's say, Tennyson or somebody like that. Um, she catches hold of him, she kisses him. The bold-faced creature says to him, I had to offer a communion sacrifice. That's why I came out to meet you. Now, what on earth is that about? Well, you see, she's just finished her menstruation. She's offered the communion sacrifice so she can't get pregnant. Therefore, she's on the razzle. She's on the lookout for a lover because she can't get pregnant. At least that's the idea. Let's enjoy the delights of love. My husband is not at home. This wonderful line. My husband's away. You know, we've heard that again and again and again. But every Hollywood movie's got that line in of a certain type anyway. It's a brilliant passage. I think it's showing us that the sexual sins, as St. Augustine so rightly said, are easy to commit. One thing leads to another. First of all, you start idling in the square, hanging around with the lads, hanging around with the callow youths. Then you wander off down the lane. Then you go to her house. You look out, you find out where her house is. Then you meet her. She catches hold of you. Well, you don't want to let go, and so on and so forth. And one thing, it's sort of an avalanche. It builds up. I think it's a brilliant passage. So do read it and do enjoy it. Instead, it does tell us something rather important, namely that people have always been unchaste. Okay, people have always been sinners. That's not news to us. The way they commit sins does change, and of course, in those days, young men would commit sexual sins with married women. It seems from this passage, this is evidence of that. They wouldn't commit sins with unmarried women because unmarried women would not want to ruin their chances of marriage by getting a reputation before they were married. So, but it does show that married women did commit adultery with young unmarried men. And of course, this was obviously a problem in the time of the Old Testament, which was why there were such terrifying punishments for adultery, which was presumably to have a deterrent effect. Yet that deterrent is not working in this case. This lady could get stoned for what she's doing, but she doesn't seem to care about that at all. And incidentally, most deterrents, maybe they deter quite a lot of people, but they don't deter everybody. Interesting, eh?